back. This is episode number 80 of Calibrated with Scott. I'm Scott, of course. Joining me today is the one, the only Alex from History Legends. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm good. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, anytime. I've been wanting to do this podcast with you for a long time. It's been a long time coming, and we have a lot to talk about today. But first, I want everybody to have a chance to go and see your content. And I know everybody doesn't listen to the end of these videos, just YouTube in general. So, Alex, tell everybody what you got going on.
Yeah, so the next video is going to be about the British Army recruitment crisis and how woke ideology is actually destroying their numbers. So we'll take a look at that.
Yeah, that should be a really good video. It's a topic that I've covered on Twitter a couple times over the past couple years, just talking about the U.S. and Britain both having these recruitment issues.
Well, what do you think about it, if we can talk about it?
In the U.S., it's horrible. It is,
Oh.
it is really bad. It was bad 4 or 5 years ago, and it has just progressively gotten worse and worse. There's not really a good incentive now to join the military. The pay is not anything exceptional. The benefits are horrible. The VA is terrible. And there's no wars to fight in. So the guys join, they spend 4 years in a barracks in California and then two tours on a boat. And it's just not what it used to be, I guess,
Right.
what the promise of the military used to be. And now with all of the COVID stuff that happened, the U.S. Army recruitment or U.S. military recruitment in general is plummeted because the sort of, not to be mean to anybody, but the core group that made up the U.S. military and recruitment is usually sort of lower class white men, right?
Yeah.
And they tend to lean Republican. And now with all of the COVID mandates and everything, a lot of the Republicans in the U.S. don't really trust the vaccine and stuff like that. And then that really just tanked recruitment because they made everybody who didn't get the shot leave and wouldn't sign anybody that wouldn't get the shot. So it has crippled the U.S. recruitment. Yeah.
And also quotas. I mean, I think they do have to get certain numbers for certain groups. So that's also something that I think it's very destructive ultimately.
Yeah.
Instead of taking the individual as one person, you're part of a group, right? Even in universities, they do that.
Yep. And instead of incentivizing the people that want to be in the military to go there, you have people that are incentivized because of the benefits that they could receive because of their skin color and stuff. So you're not always getting the appropriate people for those positions while trying to fill quotas. I mean, that's college too. You get lower test scores and stuff because you're trying to fill quotas instead of the people that maybe should be at the university.
Absolutely. And for Britain, it's the same thing, you think?
Yeah, I think I think Britain is worse just because they don't have the spending. The US has the spending, right? So they at least can upkeep their military and keep it at least at moderate strength. I mean, you look at the recent situation with I believe it was the USS Ford, where they were 700 men understaffed on that aircraft carrier, which is a big deal when it comes to like active combat situations and stuff like that. So moving away from that video, but staying on the topic of your videos, I wanted to know, how did you start to get into YouTube? How did you decide that you wanted to make the kind of content that you wanted to make? And then I want to ask you a further question about Ukraine.
Okay, so there's a long story, but I'll try to make it short for the audience. Long story short, when I was a student, I had this Instagram page that I called History Legends. It was doing fairly well. I mean, some posts were hitting 500,000 impressions, and it was growing, right? But until the moment where, with Instagram, the moment you get too popular, people in the comment section start insulting each other, and then boom, I had view suppressions, and then the account started stagnating. I couldn't reach anyone new, and it started crashing. And eventually, they actually deleted my account, 80,000 something. But I saw it coming. 2 years before it happened. So I was telling myself, what can I do? And I knew YouTube had better ways to monetize the content, because Instagram you can't monetize with your post really. So I started making YouTube videos. The first ones are really bad. I mean, please guys, don't look at the oldest videos, but essentially it's battle videos, animations. Spent a lot of time on it, but it wasn't growing fast enough, and even the resources I would put it, despite my best efforts, it would still look mediocre. Then I
Yeah.
moved on to reaction videos, so analyzing historical movies and video games, explaining to people what's historical accurate, what's not historically accurate, and not in a critical way, but just having a good time. We see a movie, we like the movie, but is it really how it happened? And then, so that was doing fairly well, and that's when the Ukraine war started. At first, I didn't really jump on the bandwagon because I didn't know how long it would last.
Yeah.
Like, we all thought it would be over within a week.
Yeah. Mark Milley. We get the
Yeah,
famous.
I mean, I was like, wow, that it actually happened. I made some posts on TikTok. I was
Yeah.
growing my TikTok at the same time. Like, it reached 500,000. So after Instagram, it was TikTok and then YouTube actually.
Okay.
And I was making videos saying, oh, they might attack during that week, and it did happen
Yep.
because it was right after the Olympic Games in China, if you remember. So the Chinese were like, don't steal the show. But eventually, I started looking into the conflict and started making videos. And at first, it didn't pick up really well, but it took me some time to get there. But over time, the big thing for the Ukraine war is, at first, I didn't know which sources to trust,
Hmm.
because it's new. You have a lot of information. You don't know who to trust. So eventually, my sources got smaller and smaller, and I got rid of the ones that were making up stuff. That's the biggest
Okay.
problem.
Yeah.
And all the propaganda, the the Western media, just ah, good old times.
Yeah, that and just to add on to that, that's exactly how I got started,
Yeah,
was trying to counteract that,
yeah,
a lot of that fake news. Um, you kind of answered my question about Ukraine, how you ended up arriving to there, in terms of your videos. In terms of yourself personally, what interests you in the Russo-Ukrainian war? Is it just the military strategy side of it? That's what a lot of people like. Is it, a personal connection? What do you attribute to your interest in this conflict?
well, let's be honest. It's the biggest war we've seen in so long.
Yeah.
So me covering his military history, it's the biggest conflict we've seen since perhaps the Korean War in terms of conventional warfare. Perhaps there was Iran Iraq, but it wasn't that much publicized. Like, we're talking about a huge war involving hundreds of thousands of men, heavy artillery, tanks, everything in the book, with two sides that are almost near peer. They have the same tactics, almost. They have the very similar equipment. It sounds like a civil war. And so I don't know what war. Maybe Iran Iraq would be the closest in terms of um, importance. But in
Yeah.
this case, modern warfare comes with conventional war. Nobody knew what to expect. Every army in the West has been training. NATO has been training for that type of war. And there it is. And we see that it's very different than we imagined it would happen.
Do you think then, just launching off from what you just said about NATO had trained for that, the Warsaw Pact had trained for that, do you think that if a conflict would have happened between them and it would have stayed conventional in Europe, do you think it would have looked completely different from how they had planned it?
It's very hard to say. Back in the days when I told you I was doing Instagram posts, I was actually, the posts that were doing well was where when I was comparing the military strength of certain countries. So I would put the total number of soldiers, then the reservists. You slide, you have the number of tanks, artillery, and people would love these. But I also realized that the European Union has a lot of people. So we're
Yeah.
talking about 450 million, something like this. Russia's what, 150 million. So the Europe has a huge advantage in population, and if we add the US, I mean, it's massive.
Yeah.
So in that case, it would have been hard for Russia, I think, because just the sheer number of people that could have been brought to
Yeah.
the front. But it's purely hypothetical because I don't know how the populations of Europe would have actually responded to going to the front. Then you have to equip them and everything. But
Do you think that NATO training, after we've seen what NATO training was in Ukraine, obviously NATO training, the NATO standard is air superiority or supremacy to cover the movements on the ground. That is the NATO training that Ukraine exhibited. Do you think that NATO training would have held up back then against the Warsaw Pact? Do you think that the Warsaw Pact's training would have held up? This is just a hypothetical that I wanted to ask you. I was thinking about it for a little while.
so, in terms of during the Cold War or now?
During the Cold War.
Oh
No
well,
drones, no.
during the Cold War, it's hard to say because there are moments where the Warsaw Pact had clearly an advantage militarily.
Yeah,
So in the first years, the Warsaw Pact had a clear advantage up until the 70s and 80s, where NATO became really strong. All
yeah,
right. But in the end, it's hard to say because it never happened. All we
yeah,
know is that the tactics the Soviets used were used by the Syrians and it failed. But at the
yeah.
same time, those are the Syrians. So perhaps the Soviets would have had different ways. But we have to say that attacking with huge army columns in urban Germany would have been complicated.
To say the least. Um,
So,
no, you're good. Go ahead.
no, it's just also to know that air supremacy would have been complicated considering the number of air defense units that the Soviets had and that the Ukrainians still use to this day, and the Russians too. And we see that it's much harder actually to break through such systems
Yeah,
than probably NATO thought.
yeah. I think probably more difficult than everybody thought. I think
Yeah.
that the even the Russians had, you know, ideas that were not to par
Hmm.
with what was actually going to happen if something did happen. Out of hypotheticals, I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a detour. I just wanted to ask that. Um, Coming into reality and the situation in Ukraine, I wanted to ask, what do you think you just put out a video. Let me start this way. You just put out a video about
Yeah.
weeks ago talking about how Ukraine could possibly win in 2024. You talked about retreats and establishing better defense lines and saving manpower until 2025 when they can maybe come back online, maybe even further. Who knows? Do you think that there will be any change in the current uh, battle plan for the Ukraine, the AFU, from the Ukrainian leadership, both military and politically?
Very good question. I mean, for Ukraine to win, we have to look at what is winning in terms for them. So for now, winning is the 1991 borders. And that in that case, they have to go on the offensive. There's not 100 ways. You have either cross the Dnieper. We saw how difficult it is to even supply a couple hundreds of men. So it will be very difficult to plan this with a huge amount of troops. Then we have the plains, the steppe of Zaporozhye, just like what happened during the summer. Once again, we saw that army columns get spotted immediately. What's left? You can attack through Donetsk. It's super urbanized. You have Bakhmut, but once again, it's very urbanized, very industrialized areas. Then you have the Kharkiv front. Okay, you can do stuff, but it's not looking good right now because the Ukrainians have to cross the Oskol River for their supplies. Once again, not ideal. So in every case, in every situation now, it's hard. So unless Ukraine decides to invade parts of Russia seriously, I mean, I think today or something, I read something about Zelensky claiming lands as ancestral Ukrainian lands that are part of Russia right now. So maybe an attack on Belgorod. I don't know. There's always been these talks about attacking Russian lands and just doing an exchange of territory. But it's going to be hard. Very hard.
So then, jumping off that question, do you see any realistic route? And I know that you had proposed a hypothetical route, but do you see that being realistic at all? Not just attacking Russia, but a what you would consider a Ukrainian victory, and not a, I guess, barring a what you might consider a Russian strategic defeat in Ukraine. And I don't mean total defeat because I don't think that that's necessarily
Yeah.
possible, but what the Russians would consider a defeat.
You see, Ukraine is a smaller nation. And when you're a smaller nation, you have to put all your energy into the battle,
Yeah.
especially when you're fighting a bigger guy. Now, I don't think Ukraine is putting the entire energy. And by that, I'm meaning the Ukrainian population.
Yeah.
A lot of people have left the country, and that says a lot about what they think about all this.
Mm-hmm.
Either they're not willing to fight the Russians or they just prefer to save their own life. They would rather save their own life than to have a self standing Ukraine. That's essentially what hundreds of thousands of people have said by moving away. Then you have people that bribe their way out of conscription. A lot of the ideologically motivated guys, all the volunteers, are either dead or wounded or spread out.
Yeah.
So the only way for Ukraine to do something is really if they tell the people this is the last moment, right? This is it. Either we all go or it doesn't happen. But right now it seems they prefer to tiptoe. They take some couple dozens of conscripts every month, but there's not a huge movement of general mobilization.
And
I mean,
it almost seems like they're trying to maintain this sense of normalcy in certain
yeah,
areas of the country,
exactly.
and to not to terrify, I guess, the people that live in these areas. And it can really be expressed through where the Ukrainians keep their air defense, I think. It
Hmm.
kind of shields areas like Lvov and Kiev from the
Hmm.
realities of the war. Even when the war was right at their doorstep, it never
Hmm.
really seemed like Kiev was ever in any danger.
Hmm.
And it does seem like the mobilization in these higher income areas like Lvov and Kiev is a lot lower than in places like Odessa and Kharkov and other areas like that. Um, Moving over to the more political side of this conflict,
Hmm.
the U.S. is waning right now when it comes
Hmm.
to the path it wants to take to support Ukraine. My first question, and there will be follow-ups. Do you think that that a budget agreement will be passed in 2024 by the U.S. for Ukraine? And with that budget, do you believe, if they do pass it, if you say yes, do you believe that it will be consistent with 2023's? Do you think it's going to be less? And then actual material goods that can be delivered, military material goods that can be delivered, do you think that even if they make promises, the West will be able to supply things like 155 millimeter artillery shells when they are looking at a possible war with Iran, that sort of direction, the Middle East, Israel is burning through shells, and they still are preparing for what they would consider, the dragon in the East?
Very good question. I mean, the US always looks at war from a geostrategic perspective. It's not
Yeah.
only one front, they look at it with all threats at the same time. And because of their navy, they can actually deploy almost everywhere. So they have multiple enemies. The US right now has Russia as an enemy, they have Iran, and they have China, the main ones. So if they over involve themselves in one country, against one country, they might have to let down the others. But right now, all the threats are legitimate. China could invade Taiwan. Iran could make moves. And we see that even with Israel right now, all the shells that could have been sent to Ukraine are sent to Israel. Israel gets priority. So for Ukraine, the biggest thing they have to do, and I talked about it a long time ago, is that they don't have their own arms industry. So a lot of it has been abandoned in the last decade or so. They didn't bother creating new industry. They had plenty of tanks. They just sold it or cannibalized parts. They didn't bother. A lot of the industries were in the east, by the way. They had been conquered by these militias. But Ukraine now is facing the situation where they thought they would have received a lot of equipment from the West, and now they're sort of betrayed. But they're only betrayed because they're naive. You know, a country that thinks strategically would have implemented their own industry really fast. That way, countries can only send them materials and they built them. Yeah, you might say the Russians could bomb the factories, but look, Germany during World War II had the biggest production ever in the middle of the biggest US bombing raids. So in 1944, 1945, they had the factories on the ground. Good luck destroying that. So I
Yeah.
think there were ways. But all this to say that just sending money, we know where it goes, right? I want to stay politically correct, but sending more money will only bring more people to the river. You know,
Yeah.
just if you bring more water to the river, there's going to be more people drinking from it. It won't go where you actually want it to go.
Yeah.
So they need actual stuff. They need helmets. They need trucks. They need everything. They don't need money per se. Yeah, just to pay for people. But it goes to show, just like you said earlier, they want to keep this normalcy, and it baffles me, honestly.
Yeah.
The
Very.
situation is everything but normal. But the Russians are trying to do the same thing, and that's what's funny, is that the Russians also do everything for their population not to feel the effects of the war. So it's as if these two countries are in a full-on conventional war, but they're also in a denial.
It is very odd. It is very odd that it's like you can be living in Moscow and you don't even think about a war going
Yeah,
on your border. You would be in Kiev, you wouldn't even probably think about the war going on for a day unless you
yeah,
heard the air raid sirens, right? Like
exactly.
there's nothing reminding you, and it's just very weird because if you think about any country during World War II, you
Hmm.
know, it was a much bigger war obviously, but you know, fully mobilized, the civilian population was fully mobilized, the economy was on a war footing, and you think if Ukraine is talking about fighting to the end, winning the fight,
Hmm.
that would be their priority. Do you think that that is the priority for Ukraine? Do you think that the Ukrainian leadership actually believes that they can win, or do you think that they are biding their time and trying to figure sort of a way out of the situation that they're in?
Well, that was the main, let's say, flaw in the video that I made, is that I don't know
Yeah.
what their goal is. I can only say what they can do if I know their political objective. But it seems to me they just want to do the same thing as before. Uh, but with less troops, I don't know. I don't know what the goal is, and maybe they don't know actually.
Are they
Right now,
gonna
they're
are they gonna telegraph it for 4 months before it happens again?
man. The trailer killed me. The
Dude,
trailer that 1 week before, I was like,
how
oh
are you?
man,
Why are you doing? Like, why? It's like they're trying to balance the PR side of it and
yeah,
maintaining support and looking cool
yeah.
while completely neglecting the operational security and the actual
Hmm.
stuff. I mean, not that there is any operational security, considering how deep Russia seems to have intelligence assets within the Ukrainian government,
Yeah,
but you know,
yeah. I don't know. I mean, there seems to be also discontent between the army and the political side. According to me, I think there's also problems between generals of the Ukrainian army. I think there are tensions. They don't talk about it openly, of course,
yeah.
but I'm sure there's stuff going on. Like, for example, why did one part of the army attack Bakhmut while this super important offensive was taking place in the south? Like, was these couple kilometers near Bakhmut so important? Really? No. Now it's all getting rolled back anyway.
So, in terms of how you see this conflict potentially ending, I'm not going to
Hmm.
ask predictions because that's ridiculous. Anything can happen. You never know.
Anything can happen.
But I do want to ask, how long do you think this war would go? I have my personal opinion on this. Um, what do you think the Russians would like to happen? And I don't mean like best case scenario, Ukraine collapses
Mhm.
tomorrow, they go in, no Western response, whatever. None of that. But a realistic ending to this, at least in theory. And so, how long do you think that the Ukrainian conflict will go on? And what do you think the end result would look like, in your personal opinion?
A lot of it will depend of what happens with the next U.S. election. Let's be honest. This will be really the core of what's going to happen. But I don't think that, even if Trump gets elected, I don't think he can just pull out like that, because he's going to do a Biden 2.0 with Afghanistan. It's going to be a disaster. So I don't think it's going to be magical either. But we know where people stand on this side. They've said enough is enough, because let's be honest, a lot of money has disappeared and we don't know where it went. That's the main reason why people want to cut the funding. So now, in terms of objectives and what could happen, I mean, the Russians are very clear on what they want. I mean, at the beginning of the war, they had a certain set of demands. Now it has changed because the war has evolved differently, and so did the demands and the requirements for peace. So if Ukraine wanted peace right now, the Russians would say no. They have invested too much. So now they would say, okay, we want all of the Novorossiya, we want all of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, if you're Russian. All right. But that could be one part. Maybe they would say, oh, we want Kharkov too. Oh, we want Odessa too. And I think the most important place for Ukraine to keep, they can lose all the fields of the east. It's not important. The most important is Odessa,
Yep.
because Odessa allows Ukraine to participate in global trade. The moment the Russians control Odessa, Ukraine becomes a landlocked nation, just like Bolivia. And if you know the history of Latin America, Bolivia, there was a war between Chile and Bolivia. So it was Chile against Peru and Bolivia. And Bolivia in this war lost all its access to the Pacific. And since then, essentially became one of the poorest countries of the continent. Because you literally have to trade, ask permission to your enemy for trade. So that would put Ukraine in a situation a bit like Belarus. So Belarus is not a massive economy either, and it always depends on the goodwill of its neighbors.
Yeah. I've always said, this has been my position since the pullback around Kiev, that
Yeah.
Odessa will never be taken by force. Odessa will be capitulated by the time that the Russians get to that part of the country. If they were to get there, it would either be through a surrender and a negotiated settlement or through a retreat and withdrawal. Do you think that
Mhm.
there will ever be a battle for Odessa?
Well, it's I cannot say there will not be a battle,
Oh,
but if we hypothetically, we're just brainstorming. Imagine the Ukrainians knowing the Russians are preparing something for Odessa. What would be the best move for the Ukrainians? It would be to establish breachheads over the Dnieper, just to make the Russians waste time to pull to destroy these breachheads,
yeah.
and just to have this sort of support zone to make sure the Russians cannot immediately cross over the Dnieper. So that's something I was thinking about in the past few weeks. Why would the Ukrainians launch these attacks that are pretty much pointless from a military perspective? They're just wasting lives.
Are you
But
talking Grinky?
yes,
Yes.
Krinky is pointless. It's a
Yeah.
pointless village. And the Ukrainians themselves, they know they cannot send a lot of forces over. So it's really small unit after small unit. It's nothing groundbreaking. However, it does stop the Russians from doing their own amphibious operations. The fact that the Ukrainians always send little mosquito units, like a little attack here and there, stops the Russians, forces them to go on the defensive, and prevents them from going across themselves. So if the Russians plan something in this sector, it's not going well. At the same time, I think the Russians have other priorities than Odessa in 2024.
Yeah.
And this is where what you say makes sense, is that at this moment right now, the Russians have bigger fish to fry from a military perspective. Um, I mean, there's Avdiivka. It's a fortress, but it's not a massive city either. And they still have to capture Kupiansk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. These are the top tier objectives, the Donbass. Before then, going across the Dnieper, unless they have an extra 200,000 men and a super solid logistics line, I don't see it happening.
Yep.
Even then, if they had to choose between a river crossing operation and going for the city of Zaporozhye makes more sense.
Of course.
So it all depends again how many forces each side has. And from what I've seen, the Russians have been pretty timid on how many forces they want to deploy.
Mm-hmm.
Although the West says the Russians are super powerful, they want to keep normal life, like we said, as well. So they're not going through a general mobilization either. They want to keep the economy running. They don't want a revolution. And I think that's the biggest thing we have to understand too, is that Putin knows history. He knows the history of his country. And he knows the biggest threat would be a war like World War One, where people rebel.
Yeah.
So he knows the history of the czars, on how the czar over involved himself in the war. So that's why Putin stays behind. He doesn't. Maybe he does stuff in real, but he doesn't. He's not seen as the commander in chief. So if there is a defeat on the battlefield, it's not on him. So that's why the people did not criticize him too much for the failures on the battlefield at certain moment. They were blamed on his generals, because he knows how the Russian people respond to certain events, Then, so that's also why he did not close the border when people were trying to leave, because all these people were mostly Russian liberals or the Russian elites. They left the country. He could have closed the border and said no, but he knew that if they left the country, there wouldn't be no threat to his power in Russia. You let all the opposition leave. Perfect. And that the West thought Russia would collapse. But all the people needed to protest and to put down the government, they're in the West, they're in Dubai, they're elsewhere. So I think there were some strategic moves that have been done. Whereas Ukraine, the problem is that they had martial law. Nobody is allowed to leave, but people still left because of corruption. I mean, even though Russia can lose 1-2 million of people abroad, it doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. But for Ukraine, it's a disaster.
This is something that I've said for a long time, and I'm curious as to your thoughts. I've thought, my personal thinking for this Ukraine project from a Western standpoint, biggest strategic mistake that they made was attacking not Putin, not the Russian government, not the Kremlin, but they made it more about attacking Russia as a whole. And I feel like it really cemented Putin in his place, and the support for Putin, when the people that were sort of in the middle ground ended up going over to that side. The Russians that were in the middle ground ended up going over to Putin's side, the pro SMO, more side of Russian politics. And then, as you said, all of the people who would have been protesting, all of the people who would have been upset about the war, ended up leaving right away. And I've always said that the Russophobia that we see out of some of the European countries in particular had to have been one of the biggest mistakes of this Ukraine conflict, because in my personal opinion, the best way that they could have caused regime change in Russia on top of a sanctions regime is using the domestic population against Putin.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
they did the exact opposite of that. They united them. And now, you're dealing with a Russo-Chinese relationship that you wanted to prevent in the beginning. So,
Yeah.
do you think that that tracks at all? I'm curious.
Yeah, it makes sense. From a geostrategic perspective, it completely makes sense. At the same time, it's the first time Europe goes through such a conventional war in a long time. I mean, there was perhaps the war in Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia. It wasn't on the same scale,
Yeah,
right? So but already then, there was a favorite. For example, Croatia was a big favorite for Europe,
yeah,
and Germany intervened to make sure they get the weapons despite every sanction. But nowadays, it's a new conflict with internet, with TikTok, social media. Also, propaganda is spreading very fast, and it's the first time people have this taste of what's going on live.
yeah,
Now, with that being said, I think, how can I put it? After that, let's say, failure from the West, the biggest failure actually is that they did not understand Russia. And if you do not understand Russia, you cannot win. If you do not understand your enemy, how can you beat him? So they thought that just imposing sanctions would be enough, without realizing that in 2014, Russia had already almost pulled out the plug and had become almost autonomous.
yeah,
So in 2014, these sanctions would have been destructive. But the fact that they were applied almost 10 years later, Russia had time to adapt. So I think, and the Russians also thought that the Ukrainian government would collapse pretty fast, and
yeah,
that didn't happen either. And I think this war makes me think of World War One, when everybody had these ideals of how war would go.
yeah,
People were talking about, oh, home by Christmas, maneuver warfare, and then the moment it happens, like Clausewitz said, the moment of friction, and then you lose control.
yeah,
The
yeah,
military tactics used by the Russians. Oh yeah, it's good to have tanks and armored vehicles. If you don't have enough infantrymen, you screw it.
yeah,
So it's all about all these things that nobody had predicted.
yeah. I think that we are. The reason why I'm interested, and it's similar to the reason you're interested, is we are watching history unfold in front of us. I think
Totally.
it's, when Putin invaded Ukraine back in 2022, I did not expect it to go 2 years. I
Yeah.
did not expect to say that I would be watching, a T-90 get battered by a Bradley in Stepova. That's a crazy thing to say, right? A U.S. made Bradley back in 2022. So the reason why I'm so interested in this is because we're seeing this ever evolving and ever
Yeah.
changing battlefield. It's gone from uh, almost no drones to
Yeah.
drones being one of the most pervasive issues, FPV and grenade drop drones in particular. Reconnaissance is now,
Hmm.
done by drones, thermal imaging, everything. Night warfare has completely changed. Do you see the US and Britain, considering your new video? I don't know if you've done any research into this, really investing in this sort of squad level drone reconnaissance and drone weaponry, because it seems like such an instrumental part of the war in Ukraine. Do you think that this is an isolated thing where these weapons won't be as effective in other battlefields? Or do you think that this is going to be the future of warfare for the next ever so,
I
long?
mean, I hope they're starting to implement drones and everything related to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah,
But as always, what's interesting with military history and the study of war, it's that you might be witnessing a conflict but take the wrong conclusions from it. I'll give you an example. During World War I, 1914 starts, then it goes into trenches. Everybody's shocked. But we know that 10 years before, there was the Russo-Japanese War. And it essentially, it was trench warfare. You had massive artillery, trenches, barbed wire, everything in the book, machine guns. How come Europeans did not learn from this conflict and applied it, the right lessons, to their own armies? Well, it's a bit simple, but I mean, from one end, they look down upon the Russians and the Japanese by saying, yeah, they don't know warfare really well. So they did not really apply these lessons. But most importantly, instead of saying trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire will be the limiting factor of warfare, the problem is that the Japanese won. And the Japanese won were the guys attacking these trenches. And the lesson was, with enough morale, with enough courage, you can win by attacking. Staying in your trenches with the barbed wire and the machine guns will make you lose. So that's why they said, let's put everything on the offensive. It's the one that attacks with the most courage that wins the battle. So, all this to say, we can witness wars but take the wrong conclusions. If the West is open minded about the reality on the ground, they will apply what they actually see and not have this propaganda filter by saying, oh, the Russian equipment is bad. Oh, yeah, the Russians don't know how to maneuver. For example, the British have very expensive tanks and they're trying to have less and less. But we see that tanks are can be lost very fast. The Challengers were hit by drones that cost a couple thousands of dollars. So wouldn't it better to have hundreds of very cheap tanks, just safe enough for the crew to evacuate and
Yeah.
to jump in another tank? What's the point of having these tanks that are made for tank to tank battles that never happen?
Yep.
So why not have smaller tanks that are cheaper to build, easier to repair, instead of having these multi-million dollar ones? That's one lesson. Drones, you said it. Every squad should be able to have a drone, maneuver with them. But with that being said, I think they're starting to do this. But there's a lot of teachings that you have to look at it with no filter, only reality. That an infantryman, a conscript, can make the difference. For example, it's better to have a conscript with 3 days of training in a foxhole than nobody there.
Yeah.
You need manpower. So it's all good to have guys with 10 years of experience. When he's in that trench next to a 3 day training guy, the shell hits the same way. So you need manpower. You need
Yeah.
ways. So Europe, they need to find ways. And that's the big problem with Britain. But Britain, every country, is that they have professionally trained armies that the big question I have is, what's the purpose, for example, of the British Army in the 21st century? Is it to have an army that can fight in at the end of the world? Is it to have the best navy? Is it to fight the Russians? Is it to fight counterinsurgency? Right now they want to do everything. And if
Yeah.
you want to do everything, you're bad at it.
Yeah.
The Russian army has one job, and it's literally to fight on its borders. So it's adapted to the terrain of Russia, everything. But some countries, they don't really have a strategic thinking of what's the purpose of their military. So the British, they're reducing every year. It went from 110,000 soldiers in the army, the ground forces, to they're projected to 65,000 very soon. 65,000, it's 2 months in Ukraine.
Yeah. It's gone like that.
It's gone. And if you don't have a reserve system, if you don't have conscription, it's going to be a mess. You know, everybody laughed at the Russians with their, oh, look at the mobilized personnel, look at the chaos, they don't have equipment. First of all, the Russians said they didn't have the weapons, but they never said we don't want to fight. They were just complaining of not having the weapons, the good weapons to fight. So
Yeah.
that's the a little nuance, you know, that we have to pick up. But what if Britain today was to mobilize 300,000 people? How would that go?
Bad.
It would be a
Bad.
chaos. Even
Yeah.
in the US, oh, how would you find the equipment, the uniforms?
Yeah.
It would be the same problem.
It would be for mobilization, like any sort of draft where it's a randomized lottery system or anything like that, would be I don't know how my generation would deal with that,
Yeah.
because the generation getting drafted, right? And I don't see anybody wanting to do any part of that. It really concerns me because, if something were to happen and we did have to
Hmm.
mobilize for some reason, I just don't think we would be able to. I just think that we're a country that is quite divided right now, uh, on most things. So there would have to be some unifying event.
Scott, I was going to ask you, what do you think of the prospects of some sort of civil conflict in the US?
Well, depending on the first thing I always say when I get asked this question is Americans really like heating and plumbing and indoors
Mm,
and not being uncomfortable. So when you talk about some sort of civil conflict, there would have to be some very, very drastic and quick overreach of the government. I imagine you're talking about the U.S. population versus the military, the government, the military, or
or,
some sort of
or
civil war in
yeah, some sort of
between.
civil
Yeah,
war.
I think we're too comfortable still. I
Hmm.
think that if things were to get much worse, we might get to that point. I think that there are people that are willing to go and fight, um, in that style of war. But I just don't see Americans being up for it,
Hmm.
honestly. Same thing
Hmm.
with recruitment. I mean, if we had a bunch of if we had to like cut off recruitment because there were too many young men coming in saying, I want to join the military, let's go, I'm all revved up,
Hmm.
then I would be like, okay, you have a young male population in your country who is vitalized and nationalistic. Maybe we can see some sort of conflict developing, but
Hmm.
I just
Hmm.
don't. I just don't see Americans having the appetite for that right now. We've
Hmm.
been sheltered and comfy since basically World War II.
Hmm. 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 Very interesting. Yeah, because I was considering studying this topic, and it's very hard. It's very many people have predicted civil wars in the U.S., but it never
I mean,
happened, right?
we've had one already, so it can't.
Yeah.
It's that far away from being reality, right?
I mean, I see the U.S. almost like the Rome, and how many civil wars did Rome have? Especially the U.S. has more and more people. That's one
I mean,
thing.
like I said, if the empire starts decaying, if our sphere of influence becomes not as strong, if the petrodollar goes down, if the
Mm,
housing market crashes, any stimulus could definitely express itself in an armed conflict within the United States.
mhm,
What would that look like, and what territory would that be on, and what lines would it be drawn on? I have no idea.
mhm,
I don't even know
mhm,
where to begin with that.
mhm, mhm.
Um, I think that if something happened and say they canceled the election for some reason in this
Yeah,
upcoming year, that that might do it. That
yeah.
I would probably go out and protest. I feel like at
Okay.
that point it would be my civic duty to go out and stand up to tyranny. Like that would be my level right there. Even though I'm
Yeah,
not super into domestic politics, and I don't think it really changes anything who's in office,
yeah, yeah.
because those aren't the people that are usually running the show. But
Mhm.
I just don't see the Americans having the appetite for it.
But you said it. What many people forget is that the countries are run by unelected officials that
Oh,
have been at in position for decades, and having a new guy doesn't really change much unless you change the entire hierarchy, the deep state, essentially. Every
and
country has a deep state.
you try to even talk about that, and I mean, you saw what happened to Trump. I mean, Russiagate was a completely faked dossier that the FBI put out, and it wasn't real. And they did that because Trump specifically targeted the deep state. I think it was one of the most beneficial things that Trump did was come out and talk
Mhm,
about the people that are running the show behind the scenes, that, the CIA, the intelligence community, because I feel like that's where a
mhm,
lot of this comes from, is the intelligence that is being provided. The CIA used to be an intelligence agency, and now it's a political
mhm,
agency. So the
mhm,
information that's being delivered to people at high places is not accurate. It's what they want to happen. It's what they they're pushing it. They're curtailing the information that's coming in. And if you listen to people that were formerly in the CIA, they talk about this, how in the 80s it was an intelligence operation because it was like the Russians, that was their
Hmm.
focus. And then after that, it became this incestuous division. It was there were
Mm.
people in different parts of the CIA that were working against each other. There's ops going on like Africa and Middle East and South America. You have all of these different operational
Wow.
zones.
They
Resources are
went
being
rogue.
yeah, it was like it was infighting, and then that
Right.
infighting becomes political. If you have
Mm.
political people on your back, you're not going to get removed from your intelligence position. You get promoted, you get jobs after, right, at Boeing,
Hmm.
whatever, so on and so on. So
Mm.
the information that's now being delivered to the people that are making the decisions, I do not believe is accurate. I believe that's where a lot of the talk about the
Mm.
situation in Ukraine,
Yeah.
the divorce from reality, I believe, comes from that deep state intelligence.
Yeah. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. For Ukraine, I think that the Ukraine propaganda was extremely effective, but too effective in a way.
Yeah,
When you drink too much of your own propaganda, it's never good. When you start taking on in your own supplies, there's videos of soldiers going to the rear to see family and friends and talk about the difficult situation at the front, and nobody believes them, or
yeah,
they barely listen.
yeah.
Oh, but the Russian orcs, they're stupid. We'll win because they're stupid. They don't know how to shoot guns. They don't know what end fires the gun. Such talk that doesn't really help. And in a way, the normalcy that we mentioned at the beginning of the video means that in a way Ukrainians don't really feel the danger, and that's a problem.
I
Damn. Yeah.
I think if they felt a little bit of that pressure, uh, especially the more decision making areas felt a little bit more of that pressure, there would be a stronger domestic movement for peace. And
But Scott, one thing that's interesting when you talked about internal politics is that the moment Biden stepped in, all hell let loose. So, Azerbaijan, Armenia, you had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, you have this war right now, Russia, you have the war, Israel Gaza, there's a war in Myanmar. Everyone is making moves. Iran, Pakistan. Who would have thought this would happen? They shell each other. You have North Korea, South Korea. Everybody's making moves. They see the weakness of the US state. And that's why the next election will be very interesting. Imagine, once again, Biden comes through. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I,
yeah, that's going to be that.
I don't know what's going to happen in the US, but like you said, people are too comfortable in the US. So, and I also think in the US, the system where you have some red states, some blue states, allows people to, instead of fighting, they flee, So they prefer. Why would you fight if you can just move across to a better state that has better values, let's say, that are more akin to what you think, and continue your comfortable life?
So, in your internal conflict situation, hypothetical, it would be Republican versus Democrat.
Most likely. I mean, these are the big political entities that actually fought each other almost during the Civil War.
See, I always thought it would be, I mean, it could be Republican and Democrat, but you would have a certain percentage of the population that would be going against the current ruling government. I feel like that would be the more Civil War situation. And then whoever sides with them would defend them.
Well, a bit like the US Civil War. The government was the Union, and then you had the Confederates that
Yeah.
were against the government.
Yeah.
It's always the same thing. And you could have states that want to secede. Ultimately, I don't think that it's for the US in its best interest to have some sort of civil war. It's never good. Let's be
Yeah.
honest. As long as there's democracy and everything can be settled with people making videos online and making Twitter posts, I mean, that's the best way to solve things, right?
It is.
Um, we, I'm saying this because we saw how it happened with Syria. Syria had a civil war. okay, Bashar al-Assad won, um, because he's still in power, but Syria is crippled. A third
Yeah,
of its territory is has foreign forces, whether it's American, Turkish. The economy is not doing great. Millions of people left abroad,
yeah.
so the country's in shambles. So is it a victory? It's a Pyrrhic victory, but it leaves the country in a shattered state.
Yeah, you talk about a place that's had some rough times, man. Since like 2012, civil wars, ISIS, they had it all.
But you
US
know, this
occupation.
region, it's like Europe during a 30 Years War
Yeah,
or that era. It's like war after war, alliance. Like you have the weirdest alliances that shouldn't make sense, but
yeah,
because of the political situation, it does. You have Israel and Saudi Arabia best friends,
yeah.
just because, although they technically they should hate each other, they're best friends because they have the common enemy, which is Iran. And then you have the Turkish forces that are also meddling, controlling parts of Iraq, Syria. So everybody has their own self interest in it. And the Middle East is like this huge bubble.
And
So,
and to add to it, we just started Operation Poseidon Archer. So
yeah, I
that's
mean,
the Houthi campaign.
that's something a lot of people have asked me to cover. I mean, I don't know what else to say apart from them bombing certain places. I mean, it's not that interesting in terms
Yeah.
of analysis, but it goes to show that the US never fully withdrew from the Middle East,
Hmm.
and they always had a foot there,
Hmm.
and they're showing everyone they can still intervene. That interview with Biden was beautiful when he said, "Oh, is it gonna stop? No, but we'll still continue."
Yeah, we're gonna keep going.
Okay, I mean,
Hey,
it
at
pretty
least
much,
he's being honest, man.
it pretty much sums up U.S. foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, he summarized it in one sentence. Got
It
to
kind
give
of
that to
it kind of
Biden.
summarizes U.S. planning in general. That's just kind of we were doing something. It's not really working, but we're just gonna keep just hammering it
Literally,
until the problem's
it's
solved.
sad. Whether we talk about Vietnam or anything, it's just like, oh, let's wing it. My God.
Yeah, it's a mess. But I'm excited for another war in the Middle East. We were supposed to.
Let's
I think it was supposed to
go.
be. I think it was supposed to be Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and then one other one. There was one other one. That was Bush's seven. They were supposed to knock out seven
Um,
countries in 7 years, and we're
but
getting to a little late.
yeah, but the thing is, a lot of these countries, they in the Middle East, they suffer from the same problem of what's happening in Africa. Is that the borders do not make sense,
Yeah,
and that's a big problem too with people in the postmodern world. Is that they see a citizen from one country one on one. So a Syrian is a Syrian,
yep,
whatever religion, tribe he's from, and that's false. And there's a lot of conflict because some people don't like each other and don't want to rule, like have to share power, always fighting about these fundamental stuff. So you have borders that don't make sense, and it creates conflict. Iraq, for example, I mean, you have the Kurds in the north, you have the Shias in the south, and then in the middle you have Sunnis. Like it's literally a third, a third, a third. Unless it's a dictatorship, how do you want to make this work? Syria has also a very diverse population. Lebanon, it's you have basically a majority Muslim that's half Shia, half Sunni, and then you have various Christian groups. How do you want to rule in such places where voting doesn't matter because every ethnic tribe has its own political party? You cannot convince people, and that's the problem. Same problem in Africa. People don't vote there for a political party like Republican, Democrat. They vote for their group. So it's the group that is the biggest, that has the biggest demographic movement that always wins. So unless people understand this and find new ways of ruling, it's going to be problematic. I think countries of the Gulf that are the monarchies, they have not implemented these Western type of voting systems, and it works well for them. They have their own systems of tribal leaders that meet and have to get together. And people don't vote. It works in a way, and that's better than having this election system. And people don't like it, and when they don't like it, they fight.
It's like
So,
forced democracy.
yeah, because for this democracy to work, you need to have implemented individualism before. And for Europe, it took centuries. And the people that made up the US, it's true, the people that made up the US are these Europeans with these individual ideals by saying, I'm going to make it in the US, me as an individual. So they went to the US with these ideals, and one day you can be Democrat, one day you can be Republican, but it's a question of who I'm voting for. Imagine if imagine in the US tomorrow you have different political parties. You have the Latino party, the Afro American party, the Asian party, and the white party. It would be a disaster
Yeah.
because you cannot change your race. You are forever that race unless you self-identify as something else. But in that regards, if political parties are according to these lines, it cannot work. So I, I don't want to rant, rant too
No,
much
go
about
ahead.
it, but in the Middle East, they've never had this individualism. They have this tribal system. Oh, I'm part of this group, this family group, this tribe. If they go this way, I go this way as well. So you need this fundamental work, and it's just not there. Just in Africa, just like in Africa, people belong to tribes, and even the tribes have subgroups.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, they identify as one individual. And I think that's part of the problems too when you have people migrating to Europe or to the US that are tribal in that sense. So they're tribal, they come with a tribal mindset, and they come face to face with people that are individuals. So there's this clashing of worldview.
Yeah.
That's all.
Oh no, you're exactly right. The reason why I pointed at you was because have you ever played Call of Duty?
Of course.
Have you played Advanced Warfare a couple years ago with
Yeah, a little
Irons?
bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounded like Iron's speech right there. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
No,
Don't
I don't
worry,
remember.
don't worry. I'll link it to you. That's why I pointed. I was like, "Ooh, that sounds familiar."
No way.
But no, you're absolutely right. That makes perfect sense. Democracy is definitely not designed for every situation in the world.
Or the way it's designed right now. So you can have some other type of democracy where tribal leaders vote,
Yeah,
and they vote, and they stay in power. They
like city
whatever.
states almost.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
example, it's a different system that wouldn't work in the US.
yeah,
But every country, just like Russia, for example, they have their own system that works. They tried the Western way; it was a disaster.
yeah.
So they pulled back. They're like, okay, the people are known to having one leader for a long time. And by the way, the advantage when you have one leader is that they can do 10, 15, 20-year plans.
Yeah.
And there's a project for the country. So the good thing is that if the leader's good, the project's going well and the country's going in the right direction. If the leader sucks, I mean, you're stuck with him forever.
One last question before we
Yeah.
get out of here. On that topic, is Putin a good leader?
Oh, I mean, he's the we cannot say he's a bad leader at all. A good leader. He's doing what's right for his country, and it's not our position to say whatever. Uh, some people hate him. I'm like, okay, no, he's actually smart in what he's doing, and but he's doing for the interest of his own country,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what every country should be doing. And a lot of countries forget that their own interest, and I think the situation could have been much worse in Russia, and he handled it pretty well. What do
I
you
think
think?
he's I think he's done a pretty good job since he got in. I mean, just the position he came in
Yeah,
with, the situation after the 90s, he had a lot of work to do. And now you're starting
yeah.
to see it kind of pay off.
The question I have is actually the big question will be what happens after Putin. I think that's the bigger question I have because Putin is rather old. He has shown what he's been capable of. He
Yeah.
brought Russia from the gutters back into the world scene as a world power. So that was a wow. He's won every war, and there's one left, last one standing. But the question is, who's next? And his legacy will be important regarding the follower. If the follower continues like this or it goes 180.
Do you think it will become sort of a Rome-esque situation where he sort of mentors somebody into that position?
If he's smart, he already started.
Yeah,
If he's
years ago,
smart,
hopefully.
he already started years ago, and perhaps it's gonna be some minister of defense. Perhaps it's gonna be someone else, but he probably already has someone in mind and taught him a lot. Perhaps the vice president. Who knows? I don't
Medvedev
know.
2026.
But I mean, he was already president. I mean,
Yeah.
at one point, but we know he wasn't the one in charge. But it's gonna be very interesting to see the follow up. I think the follow up will be very interesting.
All right. That's what we'll leave it off. I held you for a little extra longer than we planned on, but it was a
That's
good
okay.
conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, Alex. Everybody, Alex from History Legends, where can they find you? Where's your work at?
Find me on YouTube, History Legends. You can find me on Instagram, History Legends 2, because remember my first account got nuked. I'm on Twitter as well, History Legends. So anywhere History Legends is me.
And for all of you listening, you can find all of those links down below in the description. Go check out his work. It is fantastic. I imagine a lot of you already watch him, but I'm sure there's some of you who have just met Alex for the first time. His content is unbelievably well done, and
Thank
we're
you. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you, Alex, for coming on. And until next time, have a good day,
Until next
everyone.
time. Bye.